Imagine you are a woman, not a Greek woman in the traditional sense. No loom, no veil, no life confined to the inner walls of a house. You are Spartan, and from the moment you could walk, the state has had plans for your body. This is not a metaphor, this is policy. Around 650 BCE, the city-state of Sparta operated one of the most deliberate human breeding programs in recorded history. Not a myth. Not a romantic legend polished by Hollywood. Documented. Described in explicit, uncomfortable detail by ancient writers who visited, observed, and were sometimes horrified by what they found. Plutarch wrote about it in his Life of Lycurgus, one of the most important primary sources on Spartan society we have. He didn't bury the details, he laid them out plainly. So did Xenophon of Athens, a soldier and historian who actually lived in the Peloponnese and wrote his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians around 375 BCE, while these practices were still happening. What they describe is a society that approached human reproduction the way a livestock breeder approaches a herd, calculated, systematic, cold. But here's the thing, Sparta didn't build this machine out of pure cruelty. They built it out of fear. Sparta sat at the heart of the Peloponnese, surrounded by two fertile valleys watered by the Eurotas River. By the 8th century BCE, the Spartans had conquered the neighboring region of Messenia in a brutal series of wars. They didn't just take the land, they took the people. Every man, woman, and child of Messenia was reduced to a condition of state-owned slavery. These people were called helots. Here's the number that haunted every Spartan generation. The helots outnumbered their masters. Ancient sources place the ratio between 7-1 and 10-1. Paul Cartledge, professor of Greek culture at Cambridge University and one of the world's leading Spartan historians, has written extensively about this, what he calls the foundational demographic terror of Spartan existence. The Spartans were a tiny warrior class sitting on top of a massive enslaved population that hated them. Every single year, Sparta formally declared war on the Helots, a legal ritual documented by the historian Thucydides that allowed Spartans to kill Helots without pollution, without guilt, without legal consequence. That tells you everything about the anxiety inside those walls. The only thing standing between Sparta and total collapse was force. And force required soldiers. Not just soldiers. The best soldiers. Generation after generation, without fail. So, Sparta did something no other Greek city-state attempted. They didn't just train men for war, they engineered the conditions that would produce men worthy of war, starting before those men were ever born. The architect of this system had a name, Lycurgus. Whether Lycurgus was a single historical figure or a semi-mythologized composite remains debated among scholars. But the reforms attributed to him are real. Their effects are archaeologically and textually documented. And according to Plutarch, Lycurgus designed Spartan society around a single question. How do you produce the strongest possible human beings consistently across generations? The answer began with women. In Athens, a woman's world was small. She managed the household. She avoided public life. She was kept from strenuous physical activity. It was considered improper, even dangerous for her femininity. Sparta looked at that model and rejected it entirely. Spartan girls trained, not gently, not as a recreational afterthought. They ran, they wrestled, they threw the javelin and the discus, they competed in public athletic festivals. Plutarch describes Spartan girls participating in foot races, strength exercises, and open competitions, activities that would have been considered outrageous anywhere else in the Greek world. Why? The logic was explicit. Plutarch records Lycurgus's reasoning directly. Strong mothers produce strong children. A woman weakened by sedentary indoor life, a woman whose body had never been tested, could not carry healthy pregnancies or deliver robust infants. Her physical capacity was not her own business. It was a matter of state survival. Sarah Pomeroy, author of Spartan Women, published by Oxford University Press in 2002, argues that Spartan women had a level of physical freedom unmatched anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, not because Sparta was enlightened, but because Sparta needed something from them. Their bodies were a resource. The state needed that resource to perform. When Athenian writers visited Sparta and saw young women running in short athletic tunics, clothing considered borderline indecent by Greek standards, they were scandalized. They called Spartan women phainomerids, thigh showers. They meant it as an insult. In Sparta, it was a job description, but the physical conditioning of girls was only the first layer. Because once those girls became women, typically around age 18, somewhat older than the Greek norm, the state had a very specific plan for what came next, a plan that looked nothing like a normal marriage. It didn't begin with courtship. It didn't begin with family negotiations or the exchange of dowries. It began, according to Plutarch, with a kidnapping. The Spartan marriage ritual is documented in Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, chapter 15. He describes it without editorializing, the way someone describes a procedure they've watched dozens of times. A man who wished to marry did not court the woman. He abducted her. This was ritualized, prescribed. The woman had a female attendant, called a nymphutria, who shaved her head, dressed her in a man's tunic, and laid her on a simple mattress in a darkened room. The groom came at night. He visited briefly. Then he returned to the barracks where he lived and slept alongside his fellow soldiers, as he had every night since age 7. That arrangement lasted not just the wedding night, it lasted years. Plutarch writes that some Spartan men had fathered several children before they ever saw their wives by full daylight. Read that again. Multiple children, never seen the mother's face in the light of day. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't dysfunction. It was architecture. Lycurgus deliberately structured marriage around separation for a calculated eugenic reason, to keep both partners physically sharp, to ensure that when conception occurred, both parents were at peak condition rather than dulled by constant domestic cohabitation. Xenophon confirms the picture in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. Spartan marriage customs were unlike anything in the Greek world, structured entirely around the production of superior offspring, not the comfort of the couple. But the most striking feature of Spartan reproductive policy wasn't the abduction ritual or the years of nocturnal visits. It was something Plutarch describes in the same chapter, with the same matter-of-fact tone: sharing. If an older Spartan man, a man of proven military worth, of demonstrated excellence, admired the children produced by a younger man's household, he could approach that man and request permission to father children with his wife. Plutarch's exact words: if a man past his prime, but with a young wife, should take a liking to one of the well-favored and honest young men, he might introduce him to her and adopt the child born of this noble seed as his own. The reverse applied too. A younger Spartan man who admired the physical or military qualities of another man's household could request the same, with the husband's consent. There was no shame in this under Spartan law, no jealousy expected, no social stigma attached. It was eugenics, openly practiced, openly described. The explicit purpose was to concentrate the strongest physical and martial traits within the citizen population across generations. Children were not understood as belonging to a family in the way we think of today. They belonged, in a real and legal sense, to the polis, the city, the collective. Paul Cartledge, in his 2001 book Spartan Reflections, addresses this directly, situating Spartan reproductive customs within a broader political framework in which the individual family was always subordinate to the needs of the state. Private life in Sparta was a concept that barely existed. Getting a child into the world was only the first gate. The second gate was harder to pass. According to Plutarch, When a Spartan child was born, the decision of whether it would live was not made by the father. In Athens, in most of the Greek world, the father held absolute authority over a newborn. He could acknowledge it or expose it, and that was his right as head of the household. In Sparta, that right didn't belong to him. The newborn was brought before a council of tribal elders. These men examined the infant. They were looking for firmness of limb, vitality, what Plutarch calls signs of being well-bred and sturdy. If the child passed, it was assigned a kleros, a plot of land, as its birthright as a future Spartan citizen, and returned to the family. If it did not pass, if the elders judged it weak, sickly, or malformed, it was taken to a place called the apothetai. The name translates as the place of rejection. Ancient sources locate it near Mount Taygetus, the mountain range that rises west of Sparta, its highest peaks reaching over 2,400 meters. What happened there, whether infants were left on rocky slopes, cast into a specific pit or chasm, or simply abandoned and left to die of exposure, has been debated by historians for decades. In 1931, Greek archaeologist Ioannis Threpsiades conducted excavations near the base of Mount Taygetus. He found skeletal remains. The discovery generated immediate controversy. Later researchers, including physical anthropologist Maria Liston of the University of Waterloo, analyzed the site and noted that the bones included remains of adults alongside younger individuals, suggesting this may have functioned as a broader disposal location rather than exclusively an infant site. The physical evidence is fragmentary. The scholars disagree on interpretation, but Plutarch doesn't equivocate. He says the weak infants were taken to the apothetai. He says this was the law. He says it was considered not cruel, but rational, because a child who could not grow into a soldier was, by Spartan logic, a child the city had no use for, not a tragedy, a policy decision. And this is where most people stop when they talk about Sparta, the exposed babies, the warrior training, the brutal efficiency. But the machine went deeper than that, because the children who survived that inspection, the ones the elders kept, entered a system of state control so total, so psychologically engineered, that what happened in those first hours of life was almost gentle by comparison. At age 7, the boys were taken, not asked, not enrolled, taken, 7 years old. That's when the state came for the boys, not metaphorically, literally. Spartan male children were removed from their homes at age 7 and placed into a state-run system of training called the Agoge. Xenophon describes it in detail. Plutarch expands on it. Both agree on the structure. The boys lived in communal groups called agili, herds, because that's what they were in Spartan thinking, livestock being shaped into weapons. They slept on reed beds they cut themselves from the riverbank with bare hands, no blade allowed. They were given one garment per year. One, in a region where winter temperatures dropped near freezing. They were deliberately underfed, not by accident, not by poverty, by design. Plutarch writes that Spartan boys were kept in a state of controlled hunger, so they would be forced to steal food and learn to do it without being caught. If they were caught, they were beaten, not for stealing, for being caught. The punishment was for incompetence, not the act. A boy named after his grandfather. A boy who had a mother who trained alongside other women at dawn. A boy who passed the inspection of the elders on the day of his birth. That boy, at 7, stopped belonging to his family and started belonging to Sparta. The older boys in the system were given authority over the younger ones. Plutarch describes senior boys carrying whips. The violence was structured, hierarchical, pedagogical. By adolescence, the training intensified into something almost unrecognizable. The crypteia. This was the final and darkest stage of Spartan male formation. Young men, selected from the best of the Agoge, were sent out into the countryside, alone. No supplies, no weapons except a knife. Their assignment, as recorded by Thucydides and confirmed by Plutarch, was to move through the territory where the helots lived and kill, at night, silently, targeting helots who appeared strong, capable, threatening. This was not war. There was no enemy army. These were enslaved farmers being hunted in their fields. The crypteia served two purposes simultaneously. It kept the helot population psychologically terrorized, never knowing when a young Spartan shadow might appear in the dark. And it completed the psychological transformation of the young Spartan soldier, stripping away hesitation, mercy, the last traces of the child. By the time a Spartan man completed the Agoge and the crypteia, he was in his early 20s. He had spent 15 years being systematically starved, beaten, exposed to cold, forced to commit violence, and taught that personal feeling was weakness. He was, by every measure, exactly what the system intended. And that system, that entire machine of breeding, training, controlled reproduction, was supposed to make Sparta invincible forever. It didn't. The cruelest irony in Spartan history is this: the same system built to produce an endless supply of perfect soldiers slowly produced fewer and fewer soldiers at all. Historians call it oliganthropia, the shortage of men. At the height of Spartan power, around 480 BCE, when Leonidas held Thermopylae, Sparta fielded approximately 8,000 full citizen soldiers called Spartiates. Men who had passed the inspection at birth, survived the Agoge, completed the crypteia. Men the system had manufactured. By 371 BCE, that number had collapsed to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. One battle finished them. Leuctra, August 371 BCE. The Theban general Epaminondas broke the Spartan phalanx with a tactical formation no one had ever used before. The oblique attack, massing overwhelming force on a single flank. Around 400 Spartiates died in that single afternoon, 400 men. For any other city-state, devastating but survivable. For Sparta, it was existential. Because there were no replacements waiting, the pipeline was empty. Why? The breeding program had a structural flaw baked into its foundation. The laws of Lycurgus required that full Spartan citizenship, Spartiate status, pass through the Agoge, and the Agoge required resources, land, the kleros assigned at birth. When Spartan families lost land through war, debt, or death without male heirs, their sons lost citizenship. They became hypermyones, the inferiors, technically free, but excluded from the system. Wealth concentrated, land concentrated. The citizen class shrank, and the breeding program, the inspections, the physical conditioning, the eugenic wife-sharing, all of it was predicated on producing more Spartiates. But you cannot produce Spartiates without land, and land kept disappearing into fewer and fewer hands. The machine was eating itself. By the time Alexander the Great rose to power and remade the Mediterranean world, Sparta was a regional footnote. The city that had terrorized the Greek world for 3 centuries, the city that had engineered human beings the way a carpenter shapes wood, could no longer field enough men to matter. Paul Cartledge writes that Sparta's decline is one of the great case studies in how a society optimized for a single purpose becomes catastrophically fragile when that purpose meets a reality it didn't plan for. The helots outlasted their masters. The enslaved population that Sparta had built its entire civilization to control. They were still there, still farming those valleys. When the system finally crumbled, it was not the warriors who disappeared. It was the engineers. Sparta tried to build the perfect human being through total state control of the body, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. They trained women like athletes, structured marriage like a breeding program, left weak infants on a mountainside, took boys from their mothers at 7, and turned young men into instruments of controlled violence. And for a while, for a long, terrifying while, it worked. But no system built on the premise that human beings are raw material survives contact with time. Sparta is gone. The mountains are still there.